Hi, everyone, and welcome to another Ancient Warfare Answers with me, Murray. Today, I'm going to be answering one of your questions, again, flying solo. And this one, the question today is coming from Pascal, so I'll get to that in a minute. But, of course, you can ask us a question, lots of different ways. No one sent me a letter yet, but anyway, we've had people send us emails. We've had people send us messages on Facebook, tweets even, and, of course, getting in contact on the website and through Patreon. So however you get your question to us, we'll attempt to answer it if we can. And, of course, you can back the magazine and join us on Patreon, Patreon.com/Ancient Warfare Podcast, and you can even get a copy of the magazine. So today, the question from Pascal is, could you serve as a soldier, officer, or even a consul despite some form of physical handicap during the Roman Republic? And Pascal goes on in a relatively lengthy question to say that he's mostly interested in the Second Punic War and came across the example of Lucius Cornelius Scipio Asiagenus, who was considered infirmo corpore, which is kind of weak-bodied. And so the interesting thing there, of course, is that in the upper echelons of command, having some kind of physical defect is not really a barrier to your participating in warfare, generally because you're not in the front rank. And so you do indeed find injured generals, most famously probably someone like Philip II of Macedon, who lost an eye, and of course Antigonus also lost an eye. There are others which are trickier to understand. There's the story, of course, that King Leonidas of the Spartans was lame, and that, of course, ties into the stories we get in Plutarch and others that the Spartans exposed babies that weren't perfect, which is probably a fiction. And so, because you're commanding, that's probably not. Of course, in the Spartan system, you've got the issue that, well, they would have gone through the same education and agoge as everyone else. And so it really comes down to whether your injury was going to prevent you from participating fully in the warfare of the time. So, there's probably quite a few injuries that would be less problematic than others. And of course, we have multiple accounts of people suffering grievous wounds and continuing to fight in battle. Alexander the Great, for instance, collapsed lungs and all sorts of horrendousness, but continuing to fight and recovering and continuing to campaign, even though you would imagine that the recovery, especially in Alexander's case, wasn't complete and yet continued to campaign, putting armor over wounds and all sorts of things like that have gone on to become part of Hollywood as well, which is interesting because they do actually have a historical sort of precedent. Now, in the case of the Second Punic War with the Scipios, yes, you've got this idea that they're probably lame in body, but because the Roman Republican command structure didn't require the commanders to have necessarily gone through the army, and if you were a political appointment, you would still be appointed to a military command via that political pathway, regardless of any personal military training or physical fitness. I'm not just thinking about whether you've got some injury, but whether you could sit on top of a horse because of you were incredibly obese, for instance. So there's all those sorts of cases. We of course have other examples. Even Augustus himself, when he was Octavian, was physically infirm and commanded, and then took to his sickbed in multiple cases. And Agrippa commanded for him. So in that regard, there are indeed cases where a commander with a physical injury and a physical impairment that we might think would exclude them from command could indeed continue to operate in that sense. With soldiers, it's probably a lesser known sort of example. And we certainly get, stories of people being called up based on their physical fitness rather than, being unfit. We do have stories from late Roman history, of course, about people, boys cutting their thumbs off to avoid military recruitment. That's a very serious, step to take, because it's not just being able to hold a sword if you cut your thumbs off. There's many, many things you're not going to be able to do as an adult if you do that kind of thing. And I think the other thing, of course, is that there are multiple examples of soldiers fighting and continuing to fight, normally in the same battle or same campaign in a shorter period of time, when they've undergone extremely devastating wounds. There's a story of one of Julius Caesar's centurions who, is injured in the eye and rips his own eye out and then stomps on it, which is quite graphic. And, how you would continue to fight in such a case as that is unknown to me. And, you've got other sort of grievous wounds and fighting on. And of course, that ties into all sorts of ideals in the Roman Republic, especially of physical beauty. And there's always a sort of a contradiction and a contrast in that, because of course the Greeks and the Romans prized physical beauty. And if you had an impairment, or if you were diseased in some very obvious physical way, you would be shunned. So, Pliny tells us about if you walk past someone with a limp in the street, that you should spit to avoid contagion or bewitchment or, the ill luck. So, but then at the same time, if they are very obviously military wounds and you're a veteran, then there's a clear idea of dignitas and fama, and that you did it for the service of your country. And so these are actually tied in with military glory rather than physical impairment. We've, of course, got contrast there. Julius Caesar again tells his cavalry to target Pompey's recruits because they're young and concerned with beauty, tells them to target their faces so that, that they would be suffering wounds. We've got lots of examples of people in the ancient world talking about their wounds being in the front on their chest so that they stood and they didn't turn around and run away from battle. And so all of those sorts of things tie in. And it really comes down to, if you are fighting in a Roman formation, and you are wounded, and the wound is obvious, physical, doesn't prevent you from holding a spear or a sword or a shield, for instance, or marching in step and things like that, would it be problematic for you to continue to serve? And so, if, for instance, you lost an eye, is that impairment going to stop you from being an asset to your legion or your military unit? And in many cases, the answer, especially as you get higher in the command structure, is possibly not. As a soldier, just a two-year-old, maybe you wouldn't continue to serve. But if you were a veteran centurion or a veteran optio, it might be worth the unit's while to keep you around as a for your experience, but also as a good luck token, as a the grimacing veteran. And again, we hear stories of the Silver Shields fighting years after Alexander's battles, and they are an asset as veterans, and they must have suffered wounds and have been showing them. So that sort of idea is true there. And it's tricky because you've had things with I've mentioned Leonidas, but if you've also got figures in mythology like Hephaestus, who's lame, but Oedipus also, his name means kind of club-footed, so or swollen-footed. So all of those sorts of things are a sort of a contradiction to the idea of physical beauty in its purest form, and that if you are capable of continuing to fight and continuing to march, be with the soldiers and perform positive active service, chances are you could continue to be utilized in the army. Now, the other thing, of course, we've got with things like the Vindelander tablets, there are lots of other roles that the army required you to do, just as the modern army requires of its soldiers. They all are required to fight at some point, but there are other tasks within the army that need to be done. Orderlies and, sentry duty and, baking and mending armor. All of these things in the Roman army and Greek armies and all armies needed to be fulfilled. So I would imagine that the Roman military machine, even in the Republic, where it's less of a standing army and more about the responsibility of the individual consul who's raised that army, that they are looked after. When the late Republic starts to become a thing where the armies are even more loyal to the general, chances are that the general showing he's looking after you is an asset too. And we have, several veterans colonies being set up by Sulla and Marius and others. And, into the empire where the soldiers are loyal to the emperor, again, if you know that you're going to be looked after and cared for, and even if you are injured grievously, you will be used. These things are an asset to building a loyal army that will remain so. So I think that the chances are, if you could still do a job within the army, you would be utilized despite grievous wounds. If you, lost an arm or a leg and didn't die, remarkable anyway in the ancient world, chances are that's less likely because, of course, you're not going to be able to march or carry a shield or carry a spear. But there may have been examples of such things happening. Anyway, I hope that comes close to your answer, Pascal. That's my ideas on it anyway. We will see you again next time. Thanks. Bye.